America is the home of capitalism, right? I mean, it's even a question on the U.S. citizenship test. What is the economic system in the United States? The answer is the capitalist or market economy. Over the summer, U.S. President Donald Trump has done some things with individual companies that flies in the face of free market capitalism. A golden share, a cut of sales, and an equity stake.
The case of Intel was interesting, but I hope I'm going to have many more cases like it.
It's raising questions about the shape of American capitalism and what that means for businesses and consumers. So we thought we'd dig in on American capitalism. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. We all know Trump likes to shake things up. We've seen it with trade, immigration, and international relations.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
But over the summer, Trump made a number of moves on companies that flips the script on how Republicans traditionally approach business. He gave the government a golden share in U.S. Steel as part of a deal to approve Nippon Steel's takeover of that company. The share gives the government veto powers over key corporate decisions. He dropped a ban on the sale of some NVIDIA chips to China in return for getting a cut on the company's sales. And after publicly calling on the Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan to resign over his ties to China, he met him, changed his mind,
I liked his story. I thought he was good.
And said US government grants to Intel should be converted into an equity stake.
10% of Intel to the United States of America.
That was seen as a watershed moment for American capitalism, one in which the government is playing a much more interventionist role, with echoes of state capitalism, where private individuals still own the majority of businesses, but the state plays a big role in deciding what they can do. That's an economic model most associated with China, the country the US is currently competing with across a swathe of industries. So to find out more, I rang up two people who are in the thick of this story. David Gaffen is Reuters U.S. business editor in New York, and Trevor Hunnicutt is a White House correspondent based in Washington, D.C. Trevor and David, hi.
Hi.
Hello.
It's great to get us all together again. Back in the day, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, don't want to age us, we all covered finance and markets back in New York. Things are a little different now, aren't they?
We're scattered to the winds.
So, let's take a big step back. Traditionally, America is seen as the home of free enterprise, free markets, unbridled capitalism. Now, of course, that's an oversimplification, right? Because we've always had, at least certainly since the time of FDR and the New Deal, we've had expansion of government and its role in the economy. And we have seen in times of crisis, and I'm thinking about like the financial crisis back in 2008, we have seen the government help bail out companies. But what's happening now is different, isn't it, David?
That's correct. We certainly have not seen something on this scale since perhaps World War II, which was arguably a very, very different situation than we face right now. A national emergency centered around, an entire world at war. But what we have seen, and this also differs from more recent decades, where the government took stakes in things like some of the banks, automakers, things like that, when they were in trouble with the intention of getting rid of those stakes as soon as possible. This is much more interventionist. It seems to be much more scattershot. It's unclear the exact strategy other than wanting to get more from private companies in exchange for various things like grants, like smoothing out mergers. And so we've seen it across a few sectors here now. The Intel one was notable because Trump suggested that the CEO should be fired due to ties to China. Shortly thereafter, they had a meeting in the White House, and the United States had a brand new 10% stake in the company. So it's unclear if there is a broader long-term strategy going on. And that's also something that a lot of economists have raised and have grown concerned about.
Is this state capitalism? Can we call it that?
I think it's probably a little bit too early to say it that way. And also because of the unpredictability factor, I think that One thing that you do know that you have in China is a certain predictability with the government's involvement. Here, it isn't quite clear. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're doing things better. I will note that China is a country with 5 times the number of people that the United States has, and faster growing given the nature of where it is in its development. And yet its stock market is worth something like $11 trillion. U.S. companies all told are worth about $60 trillion.
And it is true, right, that the US government has provided supports that have helped, the tech sector and other sectors through the years. Ronald Reagan famously said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But during his term of office, during the Cold War era, government spending on R&D provided the blueprint for Silicon Valley's success, right?
There's been always investment by the government. That is not what's changed here. What's changed here is the involvement in getting after single companies time and again, and we've seen that on several levels now. And that creates expectations of winners and losers. It incentivizes companies to try to push for better relationships with the White House. It raises questions about crony capitalism. It adds inefficiencies, and there are a lot of worries there. Maybe that on an individual basis, some of these things turn out to be very, very good. But on a broad, larger basis, is it? We have to question that. So the answer is it's unclear at the moment.
Trevor, what's the Trump presidency saying, the Trump administration saying about all of this? Like, what's the reasoning?
I mean, there's 2 aspects to this. One, which is similar to how Biden, Trump's Democratic predecessor, handled things, and one that's completely unique. So the one aspect that is similar is there has become this consensus in Washington that is bipartisan to some degree, that industrial policy is not a bad word, that this overarching competition that the United States has, particularly with China, is not going anywhere anytime soon, and the government needs to take an active role in this. We can't just let private markets handle this alone.
It's kind of a disillusionment, isn't it, with free trade?
Absolutely. And it's bipartisan. It's across the board. It's the general public. It's the elites. It's the people in government.
Right.
And so that has been a big, big shift that we've seen. And it doesn't seem like that's going anywhere anytime soon. Now, what Trump has done is he's taken elements of that bipartisan consensus and he's moved it in a very Trumpian direction. And what I mean by that is a lot of these decisions have been ad hoc responses to political dilemmas that the administration was in. So with the Nippon Steel thing, extremely controversial whether this deal would go through, whether the unions would support it, whether the workers would support it. And so Trump kind of needed to find a way out of that pickle politically. And that was the solution that he came up with. The Intel deal, that was another situation where you had national security policy that was being kind of made on the fly a little bit. And the president decided, in a meeting, well, wait a minute, we're giving you all this money. We're doing this industrial policy. What does the United States get in return for that? When that's the kind of deal-making side of Trump, right? What do we get out of this? Why can't we have 10% of your company in exchange for this? And so that kind of off-the-cuff, person-to-person, kind of belly-to-belly negotiating style the president has brought a new element to this and a kind of unpredictable quality to it.
Trevor's definitely right on some of the disillusionment people feel. And I think that some of that has to be traced back to the financial crisis.
Right.
People talked about often the way in which the profits were privatized and the losses were socialized, that taxpayers bore the brunt of this. And we've seen rising inequality, and a lot of people are not happy with where we're headed right now. Moody's did a great analysis a number of months ago that showed that roughly 25 years ago, the top 10% in terms of income spent about 1/3 or so of our consumer spending. Now they're spending about half that.
Okay.
So you can see where all of the money is accruing to. And naturally, you're seeing a rise in, as you've said, a populist kind of direction where you want more of a control in some way to somehow even this playing field out in various ways that it's being done. Certainly on the left, Bernie Sanders, even though he did not win the nomination, certainly motivated and galvanized a lot of people. And the same can be said about Trump. They have very different approaches, but it was notable that when Trump said that they were taking a stake in Intel. One of the few Democrats who came out in support of that was Bernie Sanders.
Okay, quiz time. Now, I'm sure many of you know about the dinner Trump recently hosted at the White House for US tech leaders. They were very appreciative.
It's such an honor to be here, and the incredible work that your administration has done to support the semiconductor industry.
I want to thank you for including me this evening. It's incredible to be among everyone here, particularly you and the First Lady.
Thank you so much for getting us all together, and thank you for being such a pro-business, pro-innovation president. It's a very refreshing change.
But can you tell me which US tech boss gifted Trump a plaque with a 24-karat gold base in August? Was it A, Apple CEO Tim Cook, B, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, or C, Sam Altman of OpenAI? We'll have the answer at the end of the episode. Up next, we look at the personal approach Trump is taking to manage the US economy. I mean, does it make sense for the US taxpayer actually to get equity stakes in some of these companies, like in return for the investment? I mean, if you think about the financial crisis, Warren Buffett made a handsome profit for helping to bail out Bank of America. Why not give the taxpayer a return? Like in the case of Intel, government grants that have already been given are being converted into an equity stake.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement and a fair argument. And that's something that people do come back to. They say, why would the government merely just invest without clearly getting some kind of return on it that comes through an arrangement and a stake in these companies? I think traditionally in the past, the idea has been that the government is a broader sort of force multiplier, that it invests in places very broadly that then manifests itself in revenues for companies, jobs for people, and money that goes to the public coffers through national and state and local taxation. And economic productivity is kind of the big, broad theory of it all, which may sound high-minded. We haven't done it this way. And so there is a question about doing this. At the same time, though, it just adds in the risks of whether these investments prove to be productive or not. Because if Intel loses money, if Intel struggles, well, the government owns that too now. So that is also something that has to come into play.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the terminology that's being used is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, so in the Nippon US Steel deal, the concept of a golden share, that's something I think emerged in Europe back in the 80s and 90s. And also it exists in China. Beijing holds golden shares in Tencent and Alibaba. Even the vocabulary that's being used is really quite extraordinary.
It is, and what's notable as well is that France is somewhat much more involved in its own economy. The state has much more involvement. It's relatively regulated and so somewhat predictable, but just the same, they have a heavier hand in their state than some other economies as well. So it does vary around the world, as we've said, and it's no such thing as a real pure hog pit type capitalism. I mean, that there's always some layer of intervention. It's just what are the rules and regulations that we come to.
And the other thing that's really unique about this is how centered this current push is in the person of the president, right?
Right.
Just the fact that so much of this is rooted in this one powerful person's desires is incredibly unique. And I think it's going to be difficult for the markets to get around something that doesn't conform to the legal process that a lot of these things have gone through before. I mean, we saw with the deal that the president struck with NVIDIA, where he was going to take a percentage of the revenue of chips that they sell in China in exchange for allowing them to do that, to sell those chips in China. We saw NVIDIA's own regulatory filings that they were still waiting on certain approvals, even though that deal had already been announced, for them to be able to even explain it to their shareholders what was happening and when. So that sort of erratic policy making is something that even these US companies that want to participate are going to struggle to get their arms around.
In terms of the legal basis for some of these decisions, like for instance, the NVIDIA deal, do we know what the legal basis is, for instance, for that deal?
I think what we've seen from this administration is that they are willing to test and see what courts will allow, right? The tariffs are a great example of that in terms of how the president is using that legal authority. The administration is happy to kind of strike unusual deals and then see what happens. The NVIDIA deal, that the government has never done that before, tied a national security approval for sale of advanced technology to a revenue deal for the government. I have not seen legal concerns raised about that particular deal, but it's also new, right? We haven't actually seen that go through yet and become practice.
So is the issue here not so much what is happening, but how it's happening, like the sort of the personal nature of it?
Yes. I think some of it is we don't know exactly what the overarching plan is here. It seems to be on a one-off basis. And then the other part is that it all depends on how each of these CEOs are finding their way into Trump's office to plead their cases.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily help, for instance, say small businesses. There are a lot of small businesses that we've written about who have had problems with tariffs. They are talking about ways in which their costs are going up, and they won't get a hearing with Donald Trump. The administration has made it pretty clear, as well as some of our reporting has showed, that they don't want to really meet with industry associations. They want to meet CEOs. Well, again, they want the top two people to come in and say, hey, this is what's happening here, and hear about their companies. Again, small businesses can't do that. Individuals can't do that. They will not find a hearing on Capitol Hill. It's just not how it works. And it's always been a problem, but it's sort of, again, sort of a writ large accelerated version of all of this. And the fear that I think a lot of people have is that this will just, in a different way, further trends that we've seen towards inequality and the benefits accruing to the wealthiest that we've been seeing for quite a good long time. And you've certainly seen that there's a lot of attention given to the Elon Musks of the world and Jensen Huangs of the world.
I don't think the welcome mat is open for Elon Musk anymore, though, right?
Perhaps not, but well.
No, but I mean, what that points to, Carmel and David, is the fact that, I mean, this is very unusual. The fact that your kind of personal relationship with the president at that moment in time is so important. I mean, we started the second Trump term with the incredible image of many of the top CEOs in the country on the dais with the president during his inauguration speech. And since that day, we've seen a kind of revolving door of CEOs into the Oval Office, into private meetings with the president at Mar-a-Lago, in settings where they have to pay to enter, and then they're given a few minutes to stand up and talk about what their business needs with the president. And so this very kind of personal approach to managing the economy is enough that I've ever seen before.
Navigating politics is just one of the challenges facing tech companies in the US. Finding the power to fuel their AI ambitions is another. My colleague Kim Vanell, host of our sister show, Reuters World News, guest hosted a recent episode of Econ World all about AI and energy. I've put a link to it in the description of today's show. You can also find it on the Reuters app. Just go to Podcasts, Reuters Econ World, and AI Energy, or find it on your favourite podcast platform. Stay tuned to hear about the potential fallout in the boardroom and beyond from what Trump's doing. Even for the companies that can gain access to the Oval Office and have a good personal relationship with the president, things can go sour pretty quickly, right? Like, we see that in China as well. Like, the Alibaba co-founder criticised Beijing and boom, a blockbuster IPO was cancelled. There are lots of risks to this.
Yes, and there's also the possibility that you don't get anything from it, right?
Right.
And that you've expended this effort and this energy into having this personal relationship with the president and then aligning your company's mission with his objectives and then not seeing much of a gain from it, right? I mean, we've seen Mark Zuckerberg from Meta, Facebook, spend a lot of time with this president, and that still didn't help in terms of his legal issues. So it's not totally a predictable game when these CEOs get involved. But clearly, when you see them sitting in a round table with the president and going one by one and praising him, they've kind of calculated that that's going to get them the best results.
And there are broader market risks too, right?
Well, the risks are that this doesn't work out in a way that is efficient enough for markets, for companies, for businesses, and it requires additional changes to be made through our tax code, through the barriers that we're operating with, through a different kind of approach from the government that causes even more upheaval. And then you end up in a situation where companies find that they've allocated so much money inefficiently because they were trying to satisfy the administration. Their investments made in areas that don't need to be made in. And it's always been sort of the gospel of capitalism that they figure it out and do it their way, and things that shouldn't be funded don't get funded anymore. Again, there's an over ruthlessness on this that I think that leaves workers out in the cold sometimes, which is why we are where we are in this country right now. But that what could be the real risk is that this ends up putting the United States in a position where we have slower expected growth for a period of years due to the fact that there's a certain dynamism that is reduced from the economy.
I mean, we see it on a wider scale, don't we, in China, in terms of how the allocation of resources can be warped depending on what the government is looking for. You see sort of a massive production in certain sectors, right? Because the incentive is to invest, because it's a sector that the government champions.
That's right. Absolutely right. And I guess the thing of this is that these things can go on much, much longer than you think they would. And perhaps the Chinese economy will be shown to have been something of a paper tiger eventually, based on all of the money the government throws into things, the inefficiencies, the inefficient investment, places that are basically industrial ghost cities and things like that. But it takes a long time for that to find its way through. The United States political system is famously a bit more short-term in nature. Populist is very finicky. And so maybe that will be different here. And again, the model is not the same, but you have to keep that in mind for sure.
There's a huge risk too, isn't there, for the rivals of companies that are getting government support. How do they deal with that? They're competing again, in terms of when the government comes to decide which supplier it wants, in terms of the sort of how that rolls out in terms of practice. There is big risks there.
There's a big risk there for competitors in a lot of ways. And one of them is what you've just said. And the other one is if they are competing against this company that now has a big stake from the government, if you're involved in that business, do you go with the people that have the backing of the U.S. government, or do you go with their second and third competitors?
Right.
Which one seems like the best and most attractive option in the current political environment? That's one thing. And then the other question, of course, is that if they're invested in one, why not in the second one or the third one? What is the rational argument for it if you're going outside of the realm of this is a national emergency due to a financial crisis or some sort of incipient problem that is going to cause them to blow up and therefore put tens of thousands of people out of work? That does not exist right now. So there is a real question of, well, then why don't you make things easier for us if you only make things easier for them?
Right.
Or get your involvement in them? That's kind of the eternal question here.
I mean, we'll see what the fallout is in the future, but the fallout right now, what impact do we know is it having in corporate boardrooms as we speak? Like, is it changing how companies deal with government?
I think we know for sure that they are in part certainly looking to see how they can continue to improve their relationships. There have been a number of companies that have hired new lobbying groups that are trying to reach out to the administration and deal with and learn how to discuss things with them rather than the people that they had in place before. Certainly, they are pulling in people who are more ideologically inclined to be, aligned with the Trump people, which does happen in the past, but I think somewhat more writ large. But again, you do have questions about then what is the ask from the Trump side? And that's definitely conversations that are happening in a number of sectors. How do we get the right ear of the right person at the right time and make that work out well for us?
Right. It doesn't seem to be putting off investors, though, right? I mean, the US stock market has been hitting sort of record highs. We had a bumper IPO from Swedish fintech group Klarna, right?
Yes.
Investors themselves don't seem to be troubled by what's happening.
No, at the moment, they certainly aren't. The market is at record highs. We're valued very, very highly. A lot of those gains have been through, a good handful of technology companies way involved in the AI race, and that's the likes of NVIDIA and Oracle, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, all of whom are benefiting from the administration's focus on AI as well. And so definitely the market is doing just fine. And that's kind of the measure of success at the moment.
Regular listeners to the show know there's a weekly newsletter to accompany it called Reuters Econ World. But did you know that Reuters has a whole universe of newsletters, covering everything from the day's top news to AI and US politics? We've even got one focused on ideas for solving global crises, called Beacon. You can find all of them on the Reuters app. Just go to Menu and Newsletters. Stick around for the final part of the show. We look at the political risks to intervening in America's boardrooms. Trevor, you talk to Republican politicians all the time. Like, this is the party of Ronald Reagan, of free markets. What are they saying privately about what Trump is doing?
I think Trump has taken them to some uncomfortable places when it comes to involvement in the economy. Some of them are not big fans of tariffs. They have questions about tariff policy, and then at the same time, they're generally also pretty hawkish about China and want to make moves that will enhance U.S. competitiveness vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party. So privately, what they say is, look, this is a president who has taken the Republican Party in a much more populist and popular direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the populism is not something that Republican lawmakers are always that comfortable with, but they do like the popularity, right? They like the fact that Trump has been such an enduring political icon in the country, and they want to be on that horse, right? And so they've given Trump kind of a free hand to explore what he wants to in terms of his economic policy, obviously trying to influence it here and there, but they've kind of let him have a free run of this for now.
But there is a big political risk here.
What we've seen is that the public generally is pretty fine with this, right?
Okay.
The idea of having national champions, the idea of having government involved in kind of job creation. So far, we haven't seen a lot of pushback on that, but we also haven't seen major, notable failures yet. And anytime the government gets involved in making investment decision or private market decisions, right, sometimes those things fail. And then that can kind of create a political backlash.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the fact that the president is able to move forward with things like tariffs in such a dramatic way is because Congress is so weak right now, because Congress, relative to the president, has kind of just given him an open hand to pursue a lot of these agendas. And so you would be seeing more back and forth and more fighting if Congress were acting in kind of a normal kind of arm's length way from the president, and they just aren't right now. So we haven't seen fights over Congress wanting to take more authority in trade matters, in industrial policy matters, just because they've kind of written Trump a blank check.
On Trevor's point, which is a great one about the lack of failures yet, and yes, it is very early in this front. And one of the dangers, I think more broadly, is that you see failures and the government reacts by basically blaming capitalism and decides to apply another layer of state involvement in something to fix the previous problem that's come through. And you eventually kind of get this thing where it sort of steamrolls. And then each time there's yet another way in which, hey, we can tinker with this. And then you go down some roads that have often in the past been unsuccessful unless you have the kind of command and control economy in which success is also a certain barometer depending on where you stand, that then makes things harder to get out of. And some countries have ended up in some pretty bad recessions this way. Brazil did this about 10 years ago. And they ended up in a very bad place when they added in a lot of other state capitalism type measures here. And that became a real issue. And so we're early to see it. But, and Trevor was right to bring up the tariffs because that's a big part of this control you start to see here.
We've focused a fair bit on the downsides for China of its economic model of state capitalism, like the overinvestment in certain areas. But they have been able to really compete and in some cases dominate in certain sectors.
Right. As much money as the United States is now putting into chip development, China's putting more, right? And all of these strategic industries that the Trump administration wants to be competitive in, whether it be shipbuilding, whether it be robotics, chips, artificial intelligence, all of these areas are areas where China is investing more as a government and has a lot cheaper and more readily available inputs to put towards those industries. And so there's no guarantees that this is going to work. And when you see the conflicts like we had at the Hyundai electric battery plant over whether the foreign workers could come in to actually do this work, and then being removed from the country, things like that are going to put up additional roadblocks that might make this even harder.
Where does this leave us all, Trevor, in terms of how America does business?
I think it leaves us with a lot of questions as to where we're going from here. One, will the United States win this race that it is in? This race to dominate in the technologies of the future, the industries of the future, as it has over the past several decades. And that everything flows from that, right? The political power of the United States, the military dominance of the United States, all of it flows from the industrial magic of this powerhouse. Whether that can continue or not is very much an open question when you have China trying to dominate in all of these industries. And so the question is whether this political system, as fractured as it is and as kind of ad hoc as this decision-making is, can it compete with a truly state-backed system that is much more consolidated, much more organized, but obviously has its own risks too.
And David, for the American boardrooms, for corporate America, where does this leave them?
It's going to leave them in a very challenging place for a very, very long time here, and trying to balance the needs and wants of their shareholders, of investors, of their customers, of their employees with the needs and wants now of the administration. And if they are multinational, they're dealing with this on the other side because many of them are in China as well and having to grapple with that on that side as well. And in terms of their supply chains, when it comes to tariffs as well, it's going to leave them with a lot of decisions needing to be neutral. And then, but more often than not, trying to find a way to say, how can we set ourselves up for success, not for the next year, but for the next 15 to 20 years? Will this persist? Is this the new reality? Or is there something anomalous that will shift within a number of years as well? Certainly the personal approach that Donald Trump takes is not something that will probably be replicated by successive presidents in that kind of way. There are aspects of this that are unique to him. However, in a world where you have gigantic state-owned enterprises that are growing more powerful in the likes of China, you do wonder about where the playing field is going to be as the United States' power has been waning a bit here. And so that is a consideration that for every major CEO is going to be one that they continue to deal with for the foreseeable future.
I will just note,
Go for it.
This is apropos of nothing, but since we've been sitting here, Trump has said that he doesn't think companies should have to report earnings quarterly anymore.
Well, that's going to make life a lot easier for financial journalists in terms of getting out of bed in the morning, right?
For sure.
But it might make it a little bit more difficult to actually understand what's going on in the company.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yep.
A big thank you to Trevor and David for talking to me. It's fair to say they've got a lot going on. You can find their work on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. As for our quiz, the question was, which US tech boss gifted Trump a plaque with a 24-karat gold base back in August? Was it A, Apple CEO Tim Cook, B, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, or C, Sam Altman of OpenAI? And the answer is A, Tim Cook. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, please drop us a line in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Sound design, music composition and engineering on this episode was by Sebastian Sommer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Josh Sommer, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Wall-Jasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, Abisoye Adelusi and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.